Hello, and welcome back to another episode of One Man's Journey. My name is Christopher William, and thanks for tuning in and checking this out. I really appreciate it. Today, as I'm filming, is Father's Day, at least in those places that it's celebrated today. And I was inspired to reshare writing from a book that I had started to write several years ago, just around the pandemic hit in 2020. And I was writing this book, just something for myself, just to chronicle some of the things that I've been through in this life and how it related to certain times in my life, certain people in my life, and how it was relating to my healing journey. And one of the chapters I wrote about was about father, my relationship to my father, men's relationship to their fathers, the dynamic that is created between them, and the influence and impact that our fathers have on us, have had on us, and how it sort of colors and influences and impacts the way we see the world and the way we relate to so many things in life. And so I reshared that on my Substack page. And so I will link that in the description below if you want to check that out, because it's a bit more personal and also general around our relationship to fathers. What I felt like I wanted to do for the podcast was to focus more on my relationship and experience as a father, as opposed to my relationship to a father or to my father. But it's kind of obviously connected. I obviously, as we grow up as boys and teenagers and men, we can't help but to be influenced by the way that our fathers fathered us, right? And as we grow up, I think any person as they're growing up would say, they've seen obviously things about the way that they were fathered. So I'm not going to be like that when I'm a dad. To be honest, I didn't have a major thing about being a father until I met my first wife. And as we grew together, it became clear that I could be a dad, that if it were actually to happen, I feel like I could show up, and I'd want to show up to that. And I feel like I could do that because I did have, obviously, some good things, some good qualities that I was imparted by my father, who showed up the best that he could based on the way he was raised from his father. So I think there's this sort of legacy thing that goes down in terms of how we want to be as fathers from our experience from our fathers and their father's father, and so on and so forth. Now, I did not know my grandfather and had very little connection to my mother's father. And so I didn't really have the grandfather experience. So all I had was my own father and the experiences with him, and then how that would then translate into me being a father, being a dad. And there's a lot of things that I got from him, especially when it came to showing up and providing and working hard, and just doing what needed to be done to make sure that my daughter was taken care of. And so that was one of those good qualities, essence things that I got from him that still stay with me today. And I was able to make sure that I locked myself in, and I dedicated myself to making sure that she was going to have the best possible life that I could give her, at least in terms of provision. Now, I didn't wind up making, a bunch of money that she had all of this stuff, and we had a house and all these things that the other kids that she was going to school with had. I was more of the apartment dweller dad, and doing the best I can to make ends meet and try to save some things and offer her stuff that, she could have, such as things and trips and all that. But of course, the number one thing that I wanted to offer to her was just my heart. and to be as present as I could to her, emotionally. And that was always very challenging. It was very challenging as a young father. I had my daughter at the age of 24, which was the same age that my father, I believe, had me, which there's an interesting connection there. And so my daughter was born not so much a planned, quote unquote planned situation, though I was at the time, my first wife and I were going to be getting married. So we already had that in the mix. And so it was kind of like, when we thought about having kids, we thought, well, maybe it would be a couple of years after we were married. But as fate would have it, I think it was 3 months into our nuptials, before being married, 3 months into being just going to be married, Rihanna, my daughter, came into our lives and really changed the whole way that I had related to life. I was at the time quite in a depressed space. I was just kind of working a basic 9-to-5 job, nothing too special, delivering things. And I was finishing up with my college education and still not sure what I wanted to do with that. I was an art major. And so there's a lot of confusion about what was I doing in my life. And so then when my daughter kind of arose into the space, it really shifted what I was going to do. She gave me a sense of direction at a time when I felt like directionless. And in that way, it was something that I could show up for and gave me purpose. And so in that way, there was a huge gift that she offered me in terms of what I was going through at that time. Now, I hadn't quite dealt with what that was at the time. So it's sort of like, I think a lot of things got projected onto me being a dad. And so then I just got into that role of provision of dad and doing all this stuff that I hadn't quite dealt with that underlying stuff that was going on prior to her coming into my life. And so, and not that's the bad thing. It gave me something to work on and to be with. But there was always still something underneath me that was always kind of grinding about life. And so I think that would have a play inside of my life, inside of raising her. I did the very best I could to not bring out certain things that I remember as a child, as a kid, as a boy, that my father would do. And there was a lot of anger and that came out when I was growing up, and that had a huge impact on me. And I think there was something in me, a part of me that would refuse to want to bring out anger. But of course, if you're not dealing with that anger, it's going to come out in its own way. So there's always this push-pull inside of me of trying to be good dad. But then there's this kind of reality dad, there's this bubbling thing that would come up in me that would burst out. And I would get angry and I would yell. And I would have anger moments. And then, of course, I'd come back with a lot of guilt and shame around that. So I was always kind of in this loopy spiral. And these are things that I had not yet dealt with, integrated, healed, understood inside of myself while I'm trying to be this young dad. And so that was a very challenging time for me. And so even in that challenge, I also felt direction. I felt something alive. Like she and I were very close to each other in those early years. I would take her hiking and go out and spend lots of time with her, riding her bikes and playing in the park and all sorts of things. So we had quite a close connection, her and I, as she was growing up. And of course, then there reached the threes, which, everyone talks about the twos, but 3 was over the top. And in that, I could not seem to find something in me to be with that in a very, I don't know what the way, not rational way, but sort of just how do you deal with those energies when I had those energies? I had my own temper tantrum 3-year-old going on inside of me at the same time. So those two energies would play in the space together. And then, of course, control comes in. And how do I manage this? And, trying to be as open and understanding as possible. But then the flare ups would come up. And so, of course, what I had as growing up from my father would come out in the space in there. So there's a lot that I recognized growing up as a father, that there are some things inside of me that I was still holding on to as a legacy of my father and my father's father, and so on and so forth. So where there was this male relationship to being a dad that was very difficult inside of me, and I could tell that I was trying to change a pattern, to try to move something into a different way in relationship to my daughter. And there was a point when I recognized that I needed something to shift. I wound up going to some counseling for a while, just to pinpoint some places around my anger that I felt was really causing some issue with me being a dad in my relationship to my daughter. And she may say that she either A, doesn't remember, or wasn't a huge impact, but I know that she was impacted many times by my emotionality. So I really wanted to go in. And so I wound up going in and also doing more meditation, going back to where I was before she was born, when I was starting to do more meditation, and it was more spiritual at that point, or at least trying to press into my spirituality. And I think what happened is that it did help me relate to her more, and she got older, and it was a little bit easier to manage in terms of her own emotionality, that we came to some ease together. And she was very easy, honestly, as a child to raise and show. I was very lucky in that way. And then I was also finding ways inside of myself to take quiet times and breathe, do some exercise, whatever it was that would help me with these emotions. And so some ways I think that helped create the more easygoing dad after that. And I learned to kind of push some of those frustrations and irritations away, and I found a nice little pocket inside of myself. And I think eventually, by pushing those energies away, I had festered something in me, and I think it grew over time. And that's something that started to take a weight inside of me. And even though me being a dad found its way, I found my way being a dad with her, but being a human being, a human man, was sort of packed away. I didn't really know who that was. I had wound up becoming a elementary school teacher because I felt like I really wanted to do something that had meaning and purpose. I really enjoyed being around kids. As my daughter was growing up, I found an affinity toward working with children. And I thought, this is a great place for me to do something as a man, being in the lives of children, as well as then having a great job to be with my daughter, where I'd have summers off. I can be with her during the holidays. And it was just a great way for me to do something with that. And it was a perfect job raising a child. And then, of course, gave me purpose too, to add more male influence for children in the school. For the boys that were in school, I thought it was really necessary for boys to have a male influence at a younger age, at elementary school. And so that was finding its way, but even still in all of that, there was a struggle that could be a later conversation about the way I related to work. But so some of that parental energy came out when I was teaching. And I think just over time, something kind of weighted on me. And I do recall parts of me being it was just a struggle. Even as easy as she was, it was hard being a parent. It was hard knowing what to do and how to do it, and really wanting to be this good dad thing, and but yet still had left something parked in the shadow a long time ago prior to her birth. So a lot was coming to the head, to a head as she got older. She was a teenager, and her mother had wound up moving to Canada and getting married to a Canadian, and so she wound up moving there. And of course, that left me with my daughter on a couple of occasions as a single dad. And those, you know, I remember her and I had some good times together. We really bonded during those times. And then I always remember how challenging it was too to know what to do as a single father of a teenage daughter. And she had a great connection with her mother, so it wasn't that her mother wasn't in her life, she didn't have a connection to her. But I was the physical one-on-one solo dad for a while. And, you know, that proved to be both good and challenging, just like all the way through. And I really got the sense of like, man, I don't even know if I know what the hell I'm doing. Like, what is this thing, being a parent? What is that about? And how do I not, quote, you know, F this thing up? And that was always that anxiety too. Like, how do I deal with these growing tendencies in her? How do I navigate these new relationships she has with her friends and boys and all of that? So it was just this constant state of just like anxiety around trying to be a decent father and to raise someone in a way that you hope doesn't go off the rails. And I've been blessed. I was blessed that she was really into school and she wanted to do well in school. I didn't have to push her into any of that. So for all of that, I was super blessed. She always had kind of a shy quality about her. So it wasn't that, you know, she was into boys and wanted to have boyfriend and everything, but it felt a very sort of natural and sort of innocent kind of way. And so she did have friends that could kind of veer off into the more sexualized relationship to boys, but my daughter wanted to be more romanticized. And so as a dad, I was like, oh, thank God that was true. I wasn't going through what some other parents were going through with their daughters. And so in that sense, I was fortunate. But even still, I wonder how I would have navigated all of that too. And so in the end, my daughter wound up going to live with her mom at the age of 15 in Canada. And then I had pretty much that whole structure that I had built from the time that she was born of the dad, it kind of went away when she left at 15 years old. And I was, you know, essentially by myself in California. And of course, what came up at that time was all of that stuff that had been pushed away that I mentioned earlier. It came rushing up to the forefront. And now I am kind of dealing with all that stuff from the past. So that maybe that 23-year-old prior to my daughter coming into my life, all that unfelt and unhealed stuff comes rushing to the surface. And then I wind up kind of going off into this sort of, I guess you could call it midlife crisis kind of thing, you know, where I'm out and going to bars and hanging out and just dating women, you know, a bit younger than me. And so like this old energy was coming into my field to try to catch up to everything that had been put away by trying to be this dad. And it was a very wild time. It was a challenging time, and it was it was not a lot of fun, even though I was trying to say that I was having fun. Maybe letting go of some of the stress and anxiety of being a dad. There was some off-gassing that was going on. And it wasn't super healthy. And I think after I ran through the cycle of that is when I really decided that I needed to change my life. Something needed to shift. And so that's when I started going into doing some healing work and doing more writing and more session-based work so that I could get to pinpoint something inside of myself. And in that, with my daughter being away, I got to really kind of unpack how I was with her, and then also look back and how I related to my own father and his fathering, and then how that affected myself and then the way I fathered my child, to try to see the larger scope of what I was kind of dealing with in terms of a legacy kind of thing. And So there was a lot that I started to go through around that. And I remember as I started to go into this, I remember lots of times going to visit my daughter and really having some tender conversations with her about the way that I was, way that I wish I could have been, trying to be with her about what she felt that that didn't work for her, what she wished was different. So trying to be in a much more, human to human, rather than just being father, daughter, like who is this person in front of me who's now growing older and is going to graduate high school and she's 18. And so now there's almost like kind of like this man to a woman sort of relationship, and trying to clear up and heal some of that stuff. And it was always hard for her to bring up things that might have been challenging and hurtful to her because she was just so, I love my dad, and we had such a great relationship. But I knew that there was things that I could have done better and that were harmful or hurtful to her. And so it was a time of really trying to come to the state of, just kind of clean up that father-daughter relationship. And it got somewhere. And I recognized as I moved away, I wound up going into the spiritual community, and then moving out from Canada to Mexico and doing this whole other life, years ago in Mexico, and we had parted ways, and we had ran out of communication with each other for some time, just to create space so she could do her life on her terms without what's the right thing, me being dad and telling her what she should or shouldn't do, and even her mother. So she went ahead and had her own life from like 18 until 22 or something like that. And it was needed. And I think I'm recognizing too that that's a pivotal thing as being a parent, is letting our children have their own individuated sense of self. And that can come as a time where they almost just go out and live life on their own without communication, just to see how they navigate life. And not that they can't come and talk, but that's kind of what we did. There was just a need of just having a break from each other for a time, which was very hard for my inner dad, my dad inside, wanting to know how his little girl was, but needed to trust that she was going to find her way, and she certainly did. And she had her own struggles and her relationship to the scene and going out and partying and drinking and all that stuff that she had to navigate on her own. And so I feel like something started to heal itself from my lineage down to her, where she didn't quite go down that path. She played with it for a bit, but then navigated her way out of it because it wasn't working for her. And then as we became reacquainted later on in her early 20s, and that she came into the same community that I was in, there was still an awareness that she and I had still held this old dad-daughter frequencies. And so I think we tried our best to do that in the space together. And then as over the last few months, for some people who know my story, that I left the community and to be into my own individuated space to kind of navigate life in this new dimension that I'm still trying to sort through, that I currently do not have back and forth with my daughter. The energetic care is still there. And if there is to be a renewed relationship to her, it would absolutely be on this where, she's, I think, 28 years old now. So she'll, coming close to her 30s, and I'm in my 50s. And so then there'd have to be a new way of me seeing her no longer as just my daughter, but as this human woman in front of me who's made her own choices and has her own perception or her own paradigm, her own view of the world, her own sense of self in the world. And then if and when we do come together, it'll be these two people and kind of reacquainting ourselves to each other, and not just being in connection because we've had this blood bond together, a very, very deep and tight blood bond, obviously, and just like we all do with our kids. And not that we could ever let go of the fact that we're dad and daughter biologically, but I think spiritually and emotionally, we'd have to see each other totally different. And so that has been very challenging, another challenging part in my journey right now. And I feel like it's necessary. It's very necessary if I'm going to have a renewed relationship with her, that something is different inside of me and that I see her differently, and not just as, my daughter as a kid, which she's not anymore, but as a full-fledged adult woman. And so, yeah, that's kind of the in a nutshell relationship with me being a dad. I never had a son. I have had moments where in meditation where I've actually had tears, feeling like, wow, what a loss too, that I to not be a father to a boy. And there's almost this tenderness around, man, I kind of would like to have that experience to raise a boy, or to be in a boy's life as a father type figure, even if it's not my own child. What would I do differently? How would I be differently? What would be come back to me in my own reflection of myself, and how I would be different. It would be interesting. And so I have still some of that rumbling around with me. What would that be like to be a parent again, a father? And there's a tenderness in that. I really feel like I had an enjoyment of being a dad, and also deep challenge of being a father. And but yet there was something so beautiful about it, and so purposeful. There's nothing more amazing than being a parent. And there's nothing more heartbreaking and challenging than to be a parent, because I think there are times when we have to let our kids go. And that's really tough. That's really hard, because I think that's just part of the natural course, I think. And that doesn't mean that we come back together again at some point, but I think that's kind of an ebb and flow of the relationship. So at least that's what it's been for me. So those are a lot of words and maybe not a lot of feeling. So I'm still learning, I think, how to do this whole podcast thing, and not just be in the head, but also be in the heart. So I think I'll eventually get there. If there's any of you have any comments or relatabilities or resonance about what I've said around this, around the journey and experience and of being a father, I would love to hear that from a man's point of view, and whether you've already done it, or whether you've are in it right now, or even considering it. Any of these things, I would love to hear that. I really want this to be an interactive sort of thing, back and forth. So thank you again for taking this in, and any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe and hit the like button if you would. I'd love to feel and see community forming through all that. And if you're on the Substack podcast, thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you soon.